David Crane thought he knew everything about his wife Emily until the day she announced she was pregnant, and he remembered he'd been sterile for years. In the quiet town of Maplewood, nestled between rolling hills and endless fields, life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. Neighbors knew each other's names, front doors were rarely locked, and Sunday mornings always began the same way, with the sound of church bells ringing from St. Luke's chapel. At the center of it all stood Pastor David Crane and his wife Emily, the picture of grace and devotion. Together they embodied everything the town held dear: faith, kindness, and the quiet strength of a marriage that seemed unshakable. David was tall and dignified, with a calm presence that drew people to him. His sermons were always heartfelt, full of wisdom and warmth. Emily, delicate and radiant, complemented him perfectly. She was adored by the women of the congregation, often seen bringing food to the sick or organizing charity drives with a smile. People whispered about how lucky they were to have each other, calling them Maplewood's golden couple. For years, though, there had been one thing missing. The Cranes had no children. The town speculated quietly about why, though no one dared to ask outright. Some assumed they had chosen not to, focusing instead on their service to the church and the community. Others, more cynical, wondered if there was some private sorrow behind Emily's gentle eyes. But David and Emily never spoke of it. They just carried on, hand in hand, appearing as content as ever. Then one Sunday morning, everything changed. The chapel was packed as usual, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows and filling the room with colorful light. The townspeople sat in neat rows, waiting for the service to begin. David stepped up to the pulpit, Bible in hand, but before opening it, he set it down and smiled faintly at his wife sitting in the front pew. Emily stood up, and for the first time in years, she seemed almost shy. David announced that they had something to share. Emily was pregnant. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then, spontaneous applause and warm laughter filled the room. A few women wiped tears from their eyes as Emily pressed her hands to her stomach, smiling down at the pews. David looked proud, though his eyes were hard to read. After the service, people crowded around them, offering congratulations and promises of hand-me-down cribs and knitted blankets. Emily beamed through it all, thanking everyone for their prayers and good wishes. But David remained quiet, his smile fixed, his eyes distant. That night, when the house was finally empty and the last casserole dish had been tucked into the fridge, David sat alone in his study. A single lamp burned on his desk, casting a circle of yellow light on the polished wood. He opened the drawer, pulled out a folded letter, and read it for what must have been the 100th time. 7 years ago, after months of tests and appointments, he had sat in a doctor's office and listened as a specialist gently told him the truth. He was sterile. No chance of reversal, no treatments to try. He had come home that day and decided never to tell Emily. There was no point in making her share his pain. But now she was pregnant. David stared at the letter, his mind spinning. He wanted to believe there was some explanation, a miracle, maybe. But deep down, doubt was already creeping in, dark and persistent. He thought about the faint shadows he had seen in her eyes lately, the way she had sometimes been out late running errands she couldn't quite explain. He folded the letter again and tucked it back into the drawer. The house was silent, but his thoughts were deafening. For the first time in his life, David Crane didn't know what to believe. That night, as Emily slept peacefully in their bed upstairs, David stood in the darkened hallway, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath. He told himself he owed it to her, to both of them, to find out the truth. Whatever it took, even if he wasn't ready to face what he might find. The days after the announcement felt like a blur to David. Everywhere he went, someone stopped him to offer congratulations, their faces beaming with happiness, as though his good news was their own. Women from the congregation brought over baskets of fruit and baby clothes, and men clapped him on the back, calling him a blessed man. Every kind word and smiling face made his chest tighten a little more. At home, Emily glowed in a way he had never seen before. She moved through their house, humming softly, to herself, her hands often resting on her stomach, already protective of the life growing inside her. She spoke of nursery colors, names she liked, books she wanted to read to the baby when it arrived. David nodded, smiled in all the right places, but inside he felt as though he were standing on a precipice, teetering, looking down into the unknown. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Emily slept beside him, her face calm and content. The letter from his doctor still sat in his study, a silent accusation he couldn't bear to look at anymore. It didn't make sense. Emily wouldn't lie to him, she couldn't, but the doubt wouldn't leave him. It was like a quiet whisper that grew louder with each passing day, until it was all he could hear. David's thoughts darkened as he tried to imagine how it could have happened. Was she seeing someone? Had she betrayed him? The idea made his stomach churn, but he couldn't dismiss it. He started noticing things he hadn't before, how she kept her phone close at all times, how she sometimes seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. He told himself it was just her excitement over the baby, but then he would remember the doctor's words, sterile, irreversible, and his chest would tighten again. On the 5th night after the announcement, David made a decision. If he didn't act, he would drive himself mad with questions. He needed to know the truth, no matter what it was. After everyone had gone to bed, he sat at his desk and opened the worn leather address book he kept in the top drawer. He flipped through the pages until he found the name Claire Monroe, a former detective who had once helped him settle a delicate matter for the church years ago. Discreet, reliable, and thorough. If anyone could uncover the truth without making a spectacle of it, it was her. The next afternoon he drove to her office on the outskirts of town. The building was plain and unremarkable, a single door with her name stenciled on the glass. Inside, Claire sat behind a cluttered desk, her sharp eyes scanning him as he explained his situation in a low, steady voice. He told her only what she needed to know: that his wife was pregnant, that he couldn't be the father, and that he needed her to find out who was. She didn't flinch, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She only nodded, took notes, and assured him she would be in touch soon. Driving home, David felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Part of him already regretted what he had set in motion, but the other part, the darker, quieter part, knew there was no turning back now. When he pulled into the driveway, Emily was waiting for him on the porch, her hand raised in a small wave. She looked beautiful standing there in the fading light, her figure silhouetted against the soft orange glow of the sunset. For a fleeting moment he wanted to believe everything was fine, that their life together was still what it appeared to be. But as he stepped out of the car and felt her arms wrap around him, the doubt remained, heavier than ever. Beneath her warm embrace and radiant smile, he could almost hear that quiet whisper again, dark and insistent. Something isn't right. And soon, he would find out what it was. The following week passed slowly, each day stretched thin by the weight of David's growing unease. From the outside, everything seemed normal. Emily continued to fuss over nursery ideas. Friends kept stopping by with more gifts and well wishes, and the congregation looked at them like a couple touched by heaven itself. But inside, David felt himself fraying. He checked his phone constantly, waiting for Claire to call, wondering what she might uncover. On the 6th day, his phone buzzed late in the evening as he sat alone in his study. Claire's voice on the other end was low, calm, but carried something in it that made the hair on his neck stand up. She told him she had found something unusual, something she thought he would want to see in person. The next morning, David made an excuse to Emily about visiting a parishioner and drove to Claire's office. She didn't bother with small talk when he arrived. Instead, she slid an envelope across the desk. Inside were photographs of Emily's bedroom dresser, her hands unlocking a small drawer he had never paid much attention to before. Beneath a layer of scarves sat a slim, black cell phone that he had never seen. David stared at the photographs for a long moment, his mouth dry. Claire continued, explaining how she had followed Emily 2 nights earlier when she claimed to be running errands. Emily had parked in a quiet part of town, sat in her car for nearly an hour, texting on that same hidden phone before heading home. Claire had managed to access the phone while Emily was in the shower the next day and copied what she found. On Claire's desk lay printed transcripts of the text messages from the device. David reached for them, his fingers cold as he flipped through the pages. The messages weren't long, but they were unsettling. They were exchanged with someone saved only as S-lines like, "Meet same place tomorrow, and don't worry, it's all going to work out." The most recent message chilled him to the bone. "Soon it'll all be over." David read it over and over, trying to make sense of the words. What did they mean? Was Emily planning to leave him? Had this already been decided behind his back? He forced himself to calm down, to think clearly. The messages were vague, too vague to draw any real conclusions yet. But still, they confirmed his worst fear. There was someone else. Someone she trusted enough to confide in, to meet in secret, to tell things she didn't tell her own husband. Claire told him she was already working to trace the number behind the name S. She promised to have more answers soon. David thanked her, his voice low and tight, and left. Driving back through town, everything seemed strange to him now. The streets felt darker, the houses colder, even the church steeple rising above the trees looked like a stranger's silhouette. He couldn't stop picturing Emily sitting in their bedroom, thumbing through secret messages on a phone he never knew existed. What else was she hiding? What had she gotten herself into? When he pulled into the driveway, Emily was in the garden, planting late summer flowers, smiling faintly to herself as though nothing in the world was wrong. She looked up when she saw him, and waved, her eyes shining. David forced himself to smile back, but inside his thoughts churned. What did "soon it'll all be over" mean? That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in his study long after midnight, staring at the transcripts under the weak yellow light, reading every line until he knew them by heart. Every so often he would glance upstairs toward the bedroom, hearing the faint creak of the floorboards as Emily moved in her sleep. Somewhere in those short, cryptic messages lay the answer to everything, the truth about the baby, about Emily, about what was really happening. And he was determined to find it, no matter what it cost him. David waited restlessly for 3 more days, each hour dragging slower than the last. He continued to play the role of the loving husband, helping Emily into chairs, nodding politely when she talked about baby names, even offering to pick up groceries just to keep her smiling. But beneath his calm exterior, his nerves were stretched thin. He barely touched his food, barely slept. The sight of her fingers resting on her stomach, her soft laugh, her easy affection, all of it twisted something inside him now. Every time she looked at him with those trusting eyes, he felt a bitter pang of guilt for doubting her. But it never overpowered the darker suspicion that clung to him like a shadow. When Claire finally called, her voice was sharper this time. She told him she had found us. David drove out to her office before dawn, the streets still cloaked in mist. She was waiting for him with a folder already open on her desk. Across the top was a name he didn't recognize, Seth Porter. Claire explained that Seth was new to Maplewood, arriving only a few months ago. He worked as a landscaper and handyman, taking odd jobs around town. No family, no close ties, nothing to keep him grounded. Claire handed him a photograph of Seth, taken from what looked like a parking lot camera. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a lean, wiry build and dark hair that hung over his forehead. There was something guarded in his expression, something watchful. David studied the photo in silence, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. Claire told him Seth had done work at the church in the spring, tending the gardens and repairing some of the stonework. At first glance, he seemed quiet, even polite. But after a little digging, she uncovered a trail that painted a far different picture. Seth had a record in another state, sealed but accessible to someone with the right contacts. Assault, blackmail, harassment. Nothing recent enough to raise alarms when he came to town, but serious enough to make David's chest tighten. She added that Seth kept to himself, renting a small house on the edge of town. No visitors, no one who really knew him, but he'd been seen near the Crane home on more than one occasion. and not just when he was working. David gripped the edge of her desk, the wood digging into his palms. A stranger with a history of violence, slipping unnoticed into their lives. And Emily had been meeting him in secret. Claire's tone darkened as she described the last thing she'd seen. 2 nights ago, after Emily left home claiming she needed to pick up supplies, Claire followed her to a quiet park just outside of town. She parked a distance away, waiting as Emily sat alone on a bench. Then, after 15 minutes, Seth appeared from the shadows. They didn't touch, didn't speak loud enough for Claire to hear, but they sat close, Emily clutching her coat tight around her, Seth leaning in toward her as though whispering something. The meeting lasted only 10 minutes before they parted, walking in opposite directions. David left the office in a daze, the folder clutched in his hands. Driving home, his mind reeled with questions that felt heavier with each passing second. Who was Seth to Emily? What hold did he have over her? Was this some affair born out of loneliness, or something darker? And what did they talk about on that bench in the park? When he pulled into his driveway, the sun was just rising, painting the sky in pale gold. Emily stood by the kitchen window, sipping her morning tea. She looked serene, innocent, like she had nothing to hide. David sat in the car for a long time, gripping the photograph of Seth Porter, his jaw tight and his thoughts darker than ever. Somewhere, he thought, in the spaces between their polite smiles and quiet nights, something dangerous was growing, and he was running out of time to stop it. The following evening, David made his decision. Claire had given him Seth's address, a small rented house on the edge of town, far enough from prying eyes. She'd warned him to let her handle it, to wait for more information before confronting anyone. But David couldn't wait any longer. Each day felt heavier, each moment beside Emily more unbearable. Knowing some stranger was tangled up in her life, and somehow in the life of the unborn child she carried. As darkness settled over Maplewood, David drove through the winding back roads toward Seth's neighborhood. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. The street was quiet, lined with older homes surrounded by tall, unkempt hedges. Most windows were dark. This was the kind of place where people kept to themselves. He parked a few houses down and walked the rest of the way, his footsteps quiet on the cracked sidewalk. Seth's house looked like it hadn't seen much care, peeling paint on the doorframe, overgrown grass, swallowing the walkway. A single faint light glowed through a thin curtain. David hesitated by the side of the house, scanning the yard, listening. The faint hum of a refrigerator inside. No voices. No movement. His pulse thudded in his ears as he tested the back door. Locked. He circled to a side window, partly obscured by a bush, and slid it open just enough to slip inside. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust and something sharper, like metal. David stood in the dim kitchen, his eyes adjusting to the faint light. The place was quiet, almost eerily so. He moved slowly, careful not to make a sound, listening for footsteps or any sign Seth might be home, but there was nothing. The living room was sparsely furnished, just a couch, a coffee table littered with takeout containers, and a stack of newspapers. But it was the door at the back of the house that caught David's attention. Solid wood with a new brass lock, strange in a house that otherwise looked so neglected. It took him only a moment to find a key on a hook by the sink. He slipped it into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. The air was cooler here, and it smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended into the basement. The room at the bottom was small, windowless and lit by a single bulb that buzzed faintly, and it stopped David in his tracks. On the walls, dozens of photographs were tacked up in messy rows. Photographs of Emily. Some were clearly taken without her knowing, through a window, at the park, even outside their church. She looked startled in some, serene in others, but all of them were focused solely on her, as though she were the only person in the world. David's breath came shallow now, his eyes darting across the room. A workbench in the corner held a stack of notebooks, a camera, and a small black case. One of the notebooks lay open, covered in scrawled handwriting. "She's already mine. It's just a matter of time. They all think she's safe, but she knows the truth now." David felt his stomach turn as he read line after line. Some sentences were illegible, scratched out violently. Others repeated over and over, pages full of the same obsessive phrases. On the workbench lay something even more chilling, a folded piece of paper with a crude drawing of a baby's crib. Across it, in heavy black ink, someone had written, "When it's here, she won't have a choice." David backed away from the table, his mind racing. Whatever this was, it was bigger and darker than he could have imagined. Emily wasn't just hiding something from him. She was caught in something dangerous, something she might not even fully understand. And as he climbed the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late. The following morning, David woke with a sense of dread hanging over him like a storm cloud. He hadn't slept much after returning from Seth's house. The images he'd seen there, Emily's photos plastered on the walls, the notebooks filled with obsession and menace, were burned into his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those words again, scrawled across the page in angry black ink. "When it's here, she won't have a choice." Emily moved around the house that morning as though nothing was wrong, humming softly as she fixed breakfast. She smiled at him over her shoulder, her hair falling across her face as she stirred eggs at the stove. For a moment, David just stood there, watching her, trying to reconcile the woman he'd married with the one who was at the center of Seth's madness. He kept his voice calm when he told her he had an errand to run later, but inside, his thoughts were already racing ahead to his next move. It was time to confront her. By noon, he had gathered himself enough to ask her to sit down. Emily looked puzzled but didn't argue, lowering herself slowly onto the couch, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. David revealed what he'd discovered piece by piece, how he knew about the hidden phone, about the messages to Seth, about the late-night meetings. Emily's face went pale, and she stared at him as though the air had been sucked from the room. Then her composure broke. Tears welled up in her eyes as she admitted the truth, her voice trembling. She told him she had never wanted any of this, that she had been trapped. Months ago, she said, Seth had cornered her after one of his shifts at the church gardens. He claimed to know things about her past, things she had never told anyone, not even David. At first, she hadn't believed him, but then he'd shown her proof. Letters she'd written years ago to someone she thought she'd left behind, photographs she thought had been destroyed. Seth had threatened to expose everything to David and the entire congregation unless she did as he said. At first, it was small things, meeting him in quiet places, answering his calls. Then it escalated. He told her she had to have his child. He made her believe she had no choice. David's blood ran cold as she explained how Seth had taken her to a clinic, telling her he would handle everything. She'd been scared, confused, and too ashamed to tell anyone. She thought he would leave her alone once she went through with it. But what she said next made David's stomach lurch. Emily said Seth had assured her that the baby she carried was his, but when the private investigator arranged for a Dictwit DNA test earlier that week, something David had done without telling her yet, the results revealed something none of them expected. The baby wasn't Seth's either. David stared at her, unable to speak. Emily's face crumpled, tears falling freely now as she confessed she didn't understand how that could be true. She swore she'd never been with anyone else, never betrayed him beyond the nightmare Seth had forced her into. David stood, pacing the room as the pieces clashed in his mind. If the child wasn't his, and wasn't Seth's, then whose was it? He thought back to the basement, to the notebooks filled with Seth's frenzied scribbles, the plans he'd made, the drawing of the crib with that chilling note, "When it's here, she won't have a choice." It became horrifyingly clear that Seth had been planning something far more sinister than just an affair or blackmail. Emily watched David with pleading eyes, her hands trembling as she held her stomach, as though she were trying to shield the child from the truth that now hung in the air between them. David looked out the window, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. Somewhere out there, Seth was waiting, watching. And the question that consumed him now was no longer just who the father of the baby was. It was what Seth planned to do when it finally arrived. The next few days passed in a haze of confusion and fear. David found himself unable to focus on anything but the mystery gnawing at the edges of his mind. The DNA test results had shattered what little certainty he had left. If the baby wasn't his, and it wasn't Seth's, then whose was it? Emily barely left the bedroom now. She stayed curled up in bed, her hands constantly resting on her stomach, her eyes distant and clouded. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was thin and broken, as though each word cost her too much. David tried to comfort her, but he knew his touch didn't feel the same to her anymore. He could feel her flinch, even when she tried to hide it. David called Claire late one night, unable to sleep. He told her everything Emily had confessed, and asked her to dig deeper into Seth's background. If Seth wasn't the father, then what was his endgame? Claire's silence on the other end of the line was more unsettling than anything she could have said. Finally, she told David she'd keep him updated, and warned him not to confront Seth on his own. But David couldn't stay away. 2 nights later, he drove back to Seth's house, under the cover of darkness, parking several streets away and approaching on foot. His chest tightened as he neared the house. The front door was locked, the windows dark, but the faint glow of a light from the basement window caught his eye. He crouched low, moving closer to the side of the house, until he was just below the small window that looked into the basement. The glass was smudged and dirty, but he could just make out the scene below. Seth stood at the workbench, his back to the window. Papers and photographs were scattered across the table. David squinted, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. Then Seth stepped aside, revealing what he'd been working on. David's stomach dropped. On the table lay a tiny crib, half assembled, with pieces of soft fabric and ribbons scattered around it. Next to it was a stack of documents, birth certificates, forged papers, lists of names, and next to those sat rows of tiny baby clothes, neatly folded and tied with string. It wasn't just about Emily. David's pulse thundered in his ears as the realization struck him. Seth had done this before. He crouched there, frozen, watching as Seth picked up one of the certificates, scribbled something across it, then pinned it to the wall next to several others. From this angle, David could see more clearly now. Photographs of women and babies, different faces but the same hollow look of fear in each one. David's mind reeled. This wasn't just about revenge or obsession. This was a plan, a business. Seth was trafficking children. David stumbled backward, his breath coming fast and shallow. He nearly lost his balance as he backed away from the house. The image of those photographs burned into his mind. By the time he reached his car, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the engine. He sat there for several minutes, trying to steady himself, staring at his own reflection in the rear-view mirror. He thought of Emily at home, lying in bed, clutching her stomach as though the child inside her was the only thing keeping her alive. And he thought of Seth, standing in that basement, calmly assembling the tools of his trade, waiting for the day when the baby was born and Emily had no choice but to give it up. David gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight. Now he knew what kind of monster he was dealing with. And he knew he couldn't let Seth get what he wanted. The morning after his discovery in Seth's basement, David sat alone in his car outside the police station. He hadn't slept. The sight of those baby clothes and birth certificates haunted him, each image clearer than the last. His heart told him to go inside, to tell the police everything, to let them handle it. But something inside him hesitated. If he reported Seth now, what would happen? What if the police dismissed him? Or worse, what if Seth caught wind of the investigation and disappeared before they could act? The man had been careful, meticulous. If he slipped through their fingers, Emily and the baby would still be in danger. David started the engine and drove home instead. Emily was in the kitchen, sitting silently at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea. Her eyes looked hollow, her skin pale, as if she already knew something terrible was coming. David walked in quietly and told her to pack a bag. At first she looked at him in confusion, but he didn't stop to explain. He just repeated himself firmly, but not unkindly. Emily obeyed without a word. Within an hour, they were on the road, driving out of Maplewood, leaving the familiar church steeple and quiet streets behind them. David kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Seth's car following. But the road stayed empty. He drove for hours before finally pulling into the parking lot of a small roadside motel. He checked them into a room under a false name and locked the door behind them. Emily sat on the bed, clutching her stomach, watching him with wide, questioning eyes. David finally sat down and told her everything. What he'd seen in the basement, what Seth was really planning, the whole sickening truth. Emily's face drained of color as he spoke, and she let out a quiet sob when he finished. For a long time, they sat there in silence. Then David told her he couldn't wait any longer. If Seth realized they were gone, there was no telling what he might do next. David needed to stop him before he hurt anyone else, before he hurt Emily again. That night, while Emily slept fitfully in the motel bed, David drove back to Maplewood. He parked a block away from Seth's house and approached on foot, every nerve in his body alive with tension. The street was quiet, the windows of Seth's home dark. He slipped around to the back door and found it unlocked. This time, inside the house was silent, but as David crept down the basement stairs he froze halfway down. The light was still on, and Seth was standing there, as though he'd been waiting for him all along. Seth didn't flinch when he saw David. He just smiled faintly, as though he'd been expecting him to come back. David felt something inside him snap. The next few minutes passed in a blur. A sudden rush of movement, the crash of a chair, the sound of fists striking flesh. Seth fought back, but David's fury was too much for him. When it was over, Seth lay crumpled on the basement floor, groaning and clutching his side. David stood over him, chest heaving, his hands trembling. He grabbed the files, the photos, every piece of evidence he could find, and backed up the stairs without another word. By the time the police arrived, Seth was gone, slipped away into the night, leaving his twisted little world behind. They never found him. His car was discovered days later, abandoned by the riverbank, but no trace of him was ever uncovered. Emily gave birth to a healthy baby girl weeks later. David stood by her side the entire time, his hand in hers, determined to protect her and the child, no matter what came next. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the baby finally slept and Emily's breathing softened, David would stare out the window into the darkness, certain of only one thing. Seth Porter was still out there, and one day he would come back.